Welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Matthew Rice. Matthew is the Scotland director of the Open Rights Group, who are the UK's only digital campaigning organisation who work to protect free speech and privacy and personal data online. We spoke to Matthew all about the new EU General Data Protection Regulation that's going to be coming into force in the UK as of May of next year. You know, what it means for companies, what it means for individuals, and what it means in the general context of the fight to keep a hold of the rights and ownership of our own personal data. We also got on to a little bit of talking about the plans and proposals to censor the internet that have been sort of very vaguely floated by Theresa May and Donald Trump. And Matthew provided some really insightful points on everything we talked about. If you enjoy the show, you can like and subscribe to us on YouTube or iTunes or TuneIn or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and, just generally tell people about the show, share it with all your friends and spread the word. So here's Matthew Rice. Matthew, thanks for agreeing to chat to us. It's nice to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Yeah, we'll just jump right into it. What do you make of the data protection bill sort of working its way through Parliament at the minute? Because personally, I felt like it was a necessary step forward, but we got a bit of pushback from people saying that we were being a bit too positive about things, suggesting it was going to be difficult for businesses to comply with it. But I feel like there has to be a burden somewhere where someone has to take responsibility for the personal data of everyone, and whether that's businesses, whether that's people themselves, or even government. I feel like there has to be someone taking responsibility. Like, well, what do you make of the law? Do you think it goes far enough? Do you think it's too difficult for people to comply with? And what do you make of it?
So for us, broadly, it's welcome, and it's welcoming because of the fact that a lot of it's the language that was set by the European Commission. So it's directly applying the General Data Protection Regulation. For those people that are upset about it, I think it is telling that it's majority business and private sector. I think it's fair to say that they've had a fairly good run, a fairly huge amount of data without a lot of accountability. And so for the bill to be seen as a worry for those people that they can't comply, well, that's ultimately going to be welcome for individuals. But it's important to recognize that it's merely a set of rules. There's going to be a whole bunch of practice and experience that comes down to that's really going to be decisive about whether or not this bill actually achieves this idea of giving people back the protections or even granting actually new protections that they never had in the first place for their data. And there's also some areas that aren't so great that need to be improved upon, but we can get into more of those later.
Yeah, well, why don't we sort of clarify what the bill would do for people? So it would implement the EU General Data Protection Regulation. So the UK has agreed to uphold EU law till at least 2019 at this point. So that the regulation is set to come in of May of next year, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And from what I can tell, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the UK bill goes a little bit further than what the EU regulation sort of stipulates, which was nice to see. I'm not sure how many examples of that there are in UK law, given our sort of adverse attitude to any sort of EU legislation. So it will give you the right to be forgotten, the right to find out what data a company has about you. The right to data portability, which will, I think, force companies to delete data and information if you so request, and move them to a new service provider. It gives Is that wrong?
So I think that the best way to look at it is all these rights are kind of interlinking in many ways. So the right to data portability doesn't extend all the way to the right to erasure, but you do have a separate right to erasure. So let's look at it from like an example point of view. So the right to data portability, you are looking at changing an energy provider and you want to get a better deal. So all those meter readings you've been submitting, all those crazy photographs that you've had to take because it turns out your gas meter's like stuck in the top right hand corner and you're standing on 2 chairs to try and grab it and you've been, risking breaking your neck. You can now request for that information to be provided back to you by your energy provider in a machine-readable format, which you can then take to another provider to say, crunch these numbers, do I get a better deal out of it? And so that's the kind of idea about data portability. It's like information you've already provided that you can then receive back to you to then kind of look around for a better service. So it's kind of similar to the way that sort of finance has changed a lot in terms of people being able to switch current accounts easier, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then alongside your data portability, so imagine you've then found your new energy provider and they've got a great service for you. You go back to the existing provider and say, look, I'm moving. Whatever information you're retaining upon me, it's no longer necessary because you are no longer providing me with the service that I originally signed up for. So I'd like you to delete it. So that's the kind of two rights interacting there. And I think the additional part for the right to erasure is that it's also incumbent upon the provider to go to all the third parties that they would have shared your data with. So for instance, a smart meter provider that has then kind of blanketed your house with leaflets about installing a smart meter. That former energy provider has to return to that third party and say, this person's data is now deleted and you have to remove it from your system as it was shared by us, and we no longer have the right to share it as well. So it's a kind of, it kind of actually reverberates further, providing that it's not considered to be disproportionate or impossible to get the third party to delete it. So it's a bit of a long-winded explanation, and there's 7 other long-winded explanations for these other rights. But that's one area that we think that we can see the kind of practice sort of coming into field.
Okay, well, the other part of the law is another sort of subsection of the law is giving the ICE, the Information Commissioner's Office, more power to prosecute companies who are. Or not, I don't know if it's more power, but there's a whole host of new laws and regulations that companies will have to comply with, and they have more power to give an increased fine for a lot of sort of breaches of these regulations. And do you think that's more likely to make companies comply? Do you think they'll try and get around it in some ways? Do you think they're going to clamp down pretty hard on sort of data breaches or sort of like misinterpreting things or failing to comply with the new regulations?
I think there are some interesting changes, like particularly around so before the tests would require to show some level of substantial distress or harm caused by the data breach or the violation of the law. That's been removed, so it means that even just bad record keeping that doesn't necessarily result in data subjects' loss or distress can result in a fine from the Information Commissioner's Office. And I think that'll probably see some degree of kind of small-ish fines going out, but at a higher rate, just in that first instance. And then we'll hopefully see that companies begin to sort of comply better and understand their kind of liability. But I expect the commissioner's probably going to give some kind of leeway. There's lots of actions that a commissioner can take where it doesn't result in a fine, but would be what's called an undertaking. So it's when the company promises that they'll do a better job, and then the kind of commissioner will keep them under a little bit of monitoring to make sure that they do improve those policies and areas before they might move to an enforcement action like fining. So I don't think it's going to immediately start hitting hitting companies financially, unless they are seen to be really dragging their feet. While you're right in saying that there's going to be the aim and the purpose of both the General Data Protection Regulation and the UK's bill is to improve the rights framework for individuals. That necessarily requires it to become a bit more difficult for companies to rule the roost on our data. You can't really have both, and you've got to strike that balance. And so we just need to. And so really it is just a matter of reckoning between that new balance of scales. And what you got to hope is that at the end, both parties will look at it and say, you know what, this is a relatively fair balance between the rights of the company to use data for their purposes and the rights of the individual to take away their consent, move on to another service, erase that personal data. All of them seem eminently reasonable things for an individual to be able to do. I don't think anything has jumped out for us to be a legitimate grievance for a company to be like, no, there's no way that this user should be able to have this much control of their data. And I think really that's because companies know that ultimately when you look at it, it's a fairer framework than we've had before.
So you think this sort of like move towards people having more control of data was almost inevitable, or?
No, I think it's not. It wasn't inevitable. I mean, the language that we got into the General Data Protection Regulation, and when I say we, I mean the whole community of civil society organisations that were working in Europe for many years, like over a decade, to try and get this language right. That was a really significant fight, and there were lots. There was a lot on the line, and there was no guarantee that we would get what we got from the General Data Protection Regulation. And so I think there's a lot to be said for what was done all those years ago, which now all seems a bit. It feels like it, with the bill landing in the Parliament, that it's all just fresh and new. But actually, for a lot of people, this is the result of at least a decade's worth of campaigning and work. And so, just as a lot of things in this space, nothing was inevitable, and everything had to be really fought for. And there were even parts where, the companies, the really big companies, your Facebooks, your Googles, had some incredibly powerful lobbyists working incredibly hard to get whole swathes of the bill exactly the way that those companies wanted it. And it took a lot to try and win back the level of kind of interpretation and freedom for people's data that we eventually did get to see.
Okay, I just sort of pulled up my sort of list of things on the regulation just for references. That the current fine that the ICO can issue is £500,000. But the new law will raise it to either 4% of a company's global turnover or £17 million, whichever is greater. So that's a pretty substantial step up in the sort of ability to sort of financially damage a firm. Then something I found really interesting, and I was wondering if you thought, especially since you mentioned the sort of lobbying efforts of sort of large tech companies like Facebook and Google, that the law, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that the law would sort of in theory apply to any firms outside of the UK or the EU who are handling the data of US or of EU citizens, so that firms like Facebook or Google could be forced to comply with the regulation when they're using or storing data of EU or UK citizens. And do you think that's like legitimately enforceable? Do you think that they or that's more of a kind of sort of rose tinted view that they will be able to do this?
Yeah, it's a tough one. You're right in where it applies to. So all of the rights in the data protection regulation or the responsibilities, it revolves around whether or not it's targeted at a resident of a member state. So it's not about having your service in a particular part of the European Union. It is, are you targeting the European Union as a base for your market? And if you are, then you're going to be expected to comply with the GDPR. So that's the premise. The practice, yes, it's going to be a hell of a lot more difficult to get to Sunnyvale, California, and make sure that member states' citizens' data is being applied appropriately. But it's really a matter for those commissioners and those data protection authorities to want to take this challenge on. We've seen some authorities who've been interested in, who've kind of been more inclined to drag their feet, and we've seen some that are super engaged. Not to name names, but the Irish Data Protection Authority was not so interested in looking at Facebook when Max Schrems brought his case that led to the dissolution of the of Safe Harbor, which was the kind of US adequacy system, because the US don't have an adequate data protection regime. So the Irish Data Protection Authority weren't that interested in undermining a huge tax base bonus for having Facebook in their country, whereas places like Germany were super interested in making sure that they could levy some of the biggest fines on Instagram for having really bad terms of service. And so you've got a very wide application framework and practice framework for that. And so whether that kind of scales up to how this works internationally, it's going to come down to who's the authority that's investigating, what is it that they're particularly investigating. Is this seen as something that's going to be big enough and important enough for them to really put their resources towards discovering it? And then there's a lot more kind of international cooperation that we're seeing. So there's this whole network of data protection authorities called the Global Privacy Enforcement Network, which sounds like a bunch of amazing superheroes, but are often just people in suits looking at policies. But these things are going to have to scale up, and I think it's an inherent tension with the notion of how our data moves around the world that the regulation has to look as unfeasible as it does, because that's simply how the way the world works. Our data doesn't reside in the places that we reside in, and so we need to be trying to figure out a way to work this internationally, because that's the only way you can really get to something that's sustainable. Because all signs point to a more diverse data environment, not a smaller, more balkanized, more nationalized one. And so I think that's what the regulation's trying to reckon with. Okay, so they're kind of putting it in and hoping that they can try and figure out the best way to implement it once it's been put into law, and it's kind of we're going to put this here and then work out the sort of details of how we're going to manage to, I can't even think of the word I'm looking for. Implement. That's the one. Implement it. Yeah. Well, I mean, the important thing to note is that a lot of the regulation, because it's a regulation and not a directive, it's directly applicable. So instead of having to have this kind of margin of appreciation between the UK, you have this level of protection, whereas in Germany we have a higher level of protection, for instance. The aim of a regulation is to create a single standardized framework. And by doing that, that means that feasibly you could be using authorities to kind of combine their resources to be able to kind of better affect that international aspect, because they'd all agree on the rules of the game. So if you all agree, all of the authorities can see that this is the way that the regulation has to apply, then it becomes a lot easier for you to cooperate across borders, and then maybe even across regions. So it's not so much about we'll wait to see how this implements in Germany versus Belgium versus France. They're all going to pretty much have the same responsibilities and rights. It's going to be more about how are we pooling our resources after that fact to begin to kind of work together. Okay, Germany are really shit hot on a lot of things. On that sort of they're really there's huge fines in place for people who are sort of spreading junk news, or whatever you want to call it, fake news, or that they're really, really harsh on things that are found to be demonstrably false. And hilariously, it's not unsurprising to see the Irish pushing back on anyone doing anything to a large tech firm based there. I think, was it 13 billion euro tax bill that they don't want to collect from Apple. Yeah. But there was one part of the bill actually I wanted to ask if you could sort of
explain it in a slightly less jargony way that I'm sort of like I kind of get, but I'm not really sure exactly what it sort of means. Is that the phrase is that the legislation would create an offence of intentionally or recklessly re-identifying individuals from anonymized or pseudonymized data with an unlimited maximum fine. Could you sort of unpack what that means in like maybe plain or English for both myself and for people who are maybe a bit struggling with it?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So the idea is that so one of the biggest problems has been this idea that that anonymous data sets have been released or found in public, and they've subsequently then been re-identified. And as a result, people have had fraud happen or occur to them. A lot of it's, I think, a lot of it's actually targeted at the idea of like your talk level of hacks, where a huge amount of data has been breached. The provider says, "Don't worry about it. It's encrypted," and then it's quickly decrypted. Once it's been decrypted, then that's when people start losing their rights. Losing their identities in many ways. And so that's the way that we've read it. It's a real attempt to do that. Now, of course, there is a risk for security researchers and things like that who would be looking at doing this, but in the public good, to make sure that to point out the vulnerability in a system, and we think that the way for at least the data protection bill, the way that it's been structured, that there is a public interest defence in having in that. So it says the re-identification of de-identified personal data establishes the offence, but if you can show that you are doing this in the public interest, then it's actually not going to be a violation, and that you have a legitimate defence for that. So that could be for journalistic purposes. That could certainly be for seen as kind of security strengthening purposes. And so it's really just targeted at those people that are trying to get a hold of a large data set, re-identify it, and then start cannibalizing that information for whatever purposes they want to see. And so it's broadly welcome, actually. And it's really just trying to set up that stronger enforcement regime where it's not just talk that should be punished, but those people that were also using that talk data for whatever purposes they used it for.
Okay, so sort of just to clarify, so companies would have, amassed like a large set of data and then encrypted all the sort of names and sensitive information, and then say that data got either released accidentally, or would it have been like hacked, or would it have been leaked, or was it sort of just publicly available, or all of the above? Exactly,
all of the above. I think in the last example of just publicly available, that would be a bit more concerning. But a hack or a breach or anything of that's going to fall on the provider. Right. So why your system's not secure? Why is your data able to be removed so easily there? And then a lot of the times in those debates, it would come back. The provider would come back and say, "Don't worry about it. It's encrypted. It's anonymized." And as a result, all of our customers have nothing to fear. And then, give or take a few days later, they say, "Oops, sorry, it's definitely now been identified, and there is something to be concerned about." But all steps of the way there, that's on the provider for failing to secure. And there hasn't been anything on the other side of who's running these programs, who's re-identifying these individuals. And that's really what that offence is trying to focus on.
Okay. It's there's a new part of the law as well that means that you have to report breaches within 72 hours, I think it is, for companies. But before, just out of curiosity, like, is it when these sort of data sets are being re-identified and sort of, is it that the encryption was really poor, or that, the hackers have been able to get in and find the encryption tools they use and sort of like reverse engineer it a little bit? Or surely for encrypted data, you need the key that the company used to encrypt it, or are they just using like really complex programs to be able to find that key just by sort of working their way through like different possible, like obviously millions of different possibilities? Like how are people re-identifying the data?
I think there's lots of different approaches. Sometimes it's bad implementation of security. Other times it's that we have a very leaky environment anyway. So it only requires a few data points to be able to begin to identify individuals. So say you've got one data set that is anonymized to the point of just it's anonymized for individuals, but their postcodes are kept in it. But then there's another data set that's been leaked, and those postcodes are anonymized, but in fact their date of birth and their gender is attached.
Okay.
If you're able to begin kind of matching those areas across, say you've got at least their with that you maybe have the cities that they live in, and then you begin matching it with other publicly available data, all of a sudden your kind of 0% chance of re-identification keeps creeping up because you keep adding another bit of the puzzle to it. So it's almost like that there's never it's never the data set in and of itself that is perfectly re-identified, but it's piling in these other aspects that connect us that starts to re-identify. So that's the real kind of sneaky, much more kind of concerning one. It's that our environment actually ends up re-identifying us because there's just so much of our data kind of moving around.
Okay, so do you think the sort of harsher punishments will give us a less leaky environment then? Do you think like companies will just be sort of a lot more aware of the more severe consequences of sort of being lax with their data protection?
Yeah, I honestly don't know anymore. I mean, I think it's really an arms race, and generally the lead goes to those who are de-identifying. Who are re-identifying. I could go that again. It's an arms race, and the lead is often taken by the hackers and those who are re-identifying people. And so it's always going to be a struggle for the companies to be able to truly secure their customers' data. And I think it may be that we just don't see as much a discussion about how their data sets themselves were badly implemented, that they weren't truly secure. I think we'll see more secure data sets, but more innovative ways of breaking them. And I think that's just the natural way of things. And then again, it's going to be looking at the scenario for the authority and saying, well, is this truly reasonable? Like, did this company take every reasonable step, and then it just turned out that they came up against a proper hack group that knew exactly what they were working on, and it was just a deeply unfortunate set of events? Or is there something that they were negligent about? And in which case, then the company is going to be on the chopping block for some heftier fines.
So what would your advice, or sort of the general advice of the Open Rights Group be when you're deciding what companies you believe you should be openly sort of sharing your data with, like your bank or your, like, is there a set of guidelines you would follow for like checking out how good a company's data protection sort of regime is, or is there any companies that are particularly good at it, or is it kind of just a hit and hope sort of thing? Do you need to be looking at companies who take cybersecurity really seriously? Because a friend of mine recommended me an internet bank the other day, and I had a look at it and I was immediately turned off because they didn't mention cybersecurity anywhere on their website, and I was like, you haven't thought about this. You really haven't thought about this, or you haven't thought about it enough to decide that people should know what you're thinking about this. I was immediately like, nope, not happening.
So I don't think there isn't a set of guidelines that we have that would say this is exactly who you. This is exactly the kind of provider you want to look at. One thing that individuals could do is go on haveibeenpwned.com. So that's pwned, P-W-N-E-D. That is a massive data set of that documents all of the data breaches that are occurring around the world. So at this moment, it's getting a lot of traffic, to say the least. What it allows you to do is one area you can type in your email address to find out if you're part of leaks, but you can also look at who has been pwned or who has lost data recently, and that could kind of give you a bit of a hit list on at least who not to trust. Although what it could also give you is a sort of list of people who have had it rough and that may be actually trying to improve their practices. So have a look at a company. If they were breached in 2015, you can be sure that they've certainly had at least a few meetings subsequently to figure out how the hell that they should be improving. If you see that they got another breach in 2016, maybe they move down your list a little bit more. But if there hasn't been anything since then, it may suggest that they have learnt their lesson and that they're actually improving their practice. But there's unfortunately no real strong guidelines that are in place. Doing things like just a gut test isn't bad. I think people actually do have pretty good, when they do switch on their kind of critical evaluation skills, we generally are quite good at smelling something or seeing that something doesn't smell right or doesn't feel right for us. And so I think that's the first step. So even just like your example of, there's no mention of cybersecurity here, that sends me off into a corner of worry. I think that's a good approach. Like whatever standards you're looking for, and I hope people are looking for standards of protection for their data. That's a good start. But yeah, one area is, I would say, visit and Have I Been Pwned? Because it's fun as well.
Yeah. So say you visit Have I Been Pwned and you stick your email address and it's yes, you've been sort of compromised. Like, well, what's the next step? Because I'm going to do that when I finish this conversation. What's the
normally you'll have your provider should have got in touch with you to say there's been a breach and you need to change your passwords. The service itself actually kind of it creates different standards or different levels of breach. So it would say like this is a potential breach and this may have happened, or in terms of the kind of data that may have been lost, all the way to this has definitely happened, this is definitely bad, you need to do something about it. So Have I Been Pwned even kind of it categorizes some of those data breaches for you, okay. which is always pretty useful. But really it's about this is really just a marker for you to then return to your provider, whoever it is that's been added to that list of data breaches, and see what steps they're advising you to take. I know could sometimes feel tough to return to the kind of scene of the crime to be like, these guys are telling us now how to secure, but they will know their systems better than most, which is ironic. And they'll know what steps they need to be taking to make sure that data is secured.
So say it says maybe, is there just, go change your passwords and hope you're all right?
Yeah, it's going to be, yeah, exactly. You'll have to change your passwords. Feel free. Normally normally your provider will have set up its own particular email address or team to kind of deal with these queries about the depth and breadth of that breach, and so you should be able to find those contact details with the provider. But if you see a maybe, it would be good to change your password and re-up, and then consider whether or not you still need the service that could have been breached. A lot of times you just sign up to stuff and you just leave it there lingering, mailing lists and things like that, the real kind of low-hanging fruit, maybe consider, do I still need to be subscribed to this? Is this really something that's like super useful for me? And if not, then remove yourself, and you've removed a vector of hack there.
Okay, so moving on to, I did want to sort of discuss the particular the proposals that I feel are being made sort of haphazardly and sort of without having thought them through. So after the Manchester bombing attack, Theresa May came out in front of Number 10 and declared that, we have to start censoring the internet and cutting down on what is said online. Donald Trump has said obviously he's not a man that I just don't take seriously. I've realized that there's no point in taking anything he says seriously until something happens other than just him saying something, because there's like endless examples. He's like the transgender military ban, like whatever you think of it, nothing's happened on it, like zero. It's just a tweet, like that's all it is at the minute. It's still just a tweet. So, and he's said several times, we need to cut off certain parts of the internet, or we need to censor what's being said, and it just seems like a gargantuan, impossible task. Like if you put everyone in the UK to work on 8 hours a day of redacting things that aren't within the code, it would still take you a decade to get through all the information that's online now. Not all the information that's constantly being added. There's like an exponential growth of things being put on the internet. And do you think there's any way that you could do that? Do you think that that's like something that anyone should be worried about, or is that just sort of talk?
I don't think it's talk. I do think that there is going to be an attempt. There is going to be an initiative by at least the UK and possibly the US as well. Although I'm not so sure about the US. I don't follow it so closely. What we're going to see in the UK, it looks like a lot of it will be set up as voluntary, as a kind of voluntary effort on the service providers to try and police their content better. And so when I say service providers, a lot of it's focused on social media, right? So this is the idea that Facebook and Twitter need to figure out a way to take down offensive content within 2 hours. And for instance, that's the kind of area that it's being discussed around. So these companies don't want to find themselves in a regulatory framework on this. They would much rather be in a space where they've shown themselves to kind of voluntarily engage with that. And neither does the government really want to have to legislate for it too, for a couple of reasons. One, because it would be incredibly difficult to legislate for it, and for it not to look like an absolute censorship machine. And the other one being like they wouldn't know how to even set up those kind of protocols in law that would actually look anyway effective. So the concern is that what we've got is a voluntary censorship regime that's premised on the service providers running their systems. And this is something like the likes of which we've never had in the history of speech, right? So we're now in a position where our town halls are brought to us by Coca-Cola, and you have to agree to Coca-Cola's terms of services to speak in your town hall. And those lines have never been more fuzzier about what's acceptable and what's not. And so that's really where it's going to become almost a sea change in the way that we can understand what speech is, possibly. Because it's also voluntary, there's going to be a risk that the private sector are going to be more censorious, because they're going to err on the side of censor rather than continue down the path of having to become regulated. So it may not be that we have the censorship police, so to speak, but that we're policed by our service providers in a much more kind of fundamental way. And the solutions that they'll come up with for doing that, because of, like you're saying, that just the scale of information that's being added, in no way can this really be a truly human process. So we're also going to have to reckon with the notion of automation and how that comes into it, and and if you're running bots and scripts that are trying to detect speech that should be restricted, how tight are they going to be? How well formed are they going to be to understand the context in which people are speaking in, and the different contexts that society will find itself in? Is a US bot programmed with First Amendment versus a UK bot which is programmed with the European Convention? Like, how did those two things interact? And so does that mean that the US, if you're logged into Facebook in the US, you're going to see more speech because there's a higher degree of free speech in the US than there is, say, in Europe in some cases? All of those practical questions are the things that are kind of unanswerable, and the reason why the government doesn't necessarily want to find itself in a kind of legislative battle there. But to take a very kind of long-winded answer to your short question, I think we will see something, and it's going to be a matter of just how profound a shift it's going to be, because we're already in very uncharted territory now, just on that premise that these private companies are now our gateway to speech. It's a very, very strange situation.
Yeah, we've done like quite a bit of writing about this sort of thing. Like there's the amount of different platforms and the different ways they're kind of attempting to tackle this. Like at first, Twitter were very resistant to this. They were just kind of like, nope, Twitter's real-time nature means that things get fact-checked and the proper information will always rise to the top. Facebook sort of straight after, like, we're initially like, there's no fake news on Facebook. What do you mean? And then, then since have been like, oh, maybe there was a few things that we could maybe talk about. So they've now partnered with a whole load of fact checkers, and they will kind of go through things, but it can take up to a day for them to like do a proper fact check on things. And then they will get like marked as disputed. Then YouTube have been really heavy-handed. They've started demonetizing any video content that is deemed to be controversial. Now, how you discern what's controversial and what's not is very, very, a very slippery slope. For a while, Jordan Peterson, who's just a professor, like a clinical psychiatrist, I think it is, or psychologist, one or two. He was removed from YouTube for a while, and it was just like, what? Like, because there are some crazy people online, right? But Jordan Peterson is not a crazy person. He's incredibly well read. He's incredibly well considered in everything he says. You know, he might have some controversial suggestions about like neo-Marxism and postmodernism and you know, transgender rights and all that, but he's a smart, well-read, well-backed up, well-thought-through guy, but that's now too controversial for YouTube. And I feel like we also did a piece about sort of trying to weigh up where sites or whether sites should police content online. And we kind of came to the conclusion that the internet is like almost the purest expression of freedom of speech that we've like created, and that to try and clamp down on that is really just a censorship of the like most base form. But the real problem is this thing called the illusion of truth principle, is where if someone sees something, even if it's true, and it's then proved to be untrue and you're told it's untrue, you're still more likely to believe that's true because you've seen it. And that is a really difficult concept to get out of people's heads. And ultimately, I think the remedy is education and trying to get people to realize, like, just like you were saying earlier, people kind of have an instinct for when something's not quite right, when you were talking about the sort of protecting your own data and cybersecurity. And that's probably the way we need to go. But I honestly don't know how they do it. And that's interesting. You think there will be something. But I guess we'll see what sort of form it takes. Yeah. I mean, look, you've got
social media giants hiring psychologists to figure out how you keep users on their platforms for 15 seconds longer than they would want to be, and like to re-stimulate people's minds and re-engage their dopamine principle, like their dopamine receptors, so that they'll stay on and keep on clicking and keep on sharing. Like that's a genuine stream of work that those companies undertake, because it's in their interests. And so there is a level of it feels weird to say, but there is a level of manipulation that goes on in the way that we surf and move across the internet, because these platforms are so good at figuring out what it is that trickles us, like kind of tricks us into staying on there. And I think that's, I think the illusion of truth principle, although this is like I haven't really looked at it much, but that's an aspect. There's an aspect of all of that manipulation is part of that. Like it's a thing that we trust is quite important for us to remain engaged in something. So you need something, that thing needs to be trusted for you to stay on it. You don't often stay in things that you immediately feel distrusting of. So instead, it would seem like what needs to be done is those same psychologists that were trying to figure out how you keep those people on there with their little dopamine hits need to also begin to think about how you allow people to re-engage their critical faculties a little bit more. And that's one aspect. So in terms of like the providers becoming a bit more responsible for what it is that they're actually having us do while we're on their sites. But in a more fundamental way, totally agree that there is a hell of a lot more education that needs to go on. We don't really, as a society, we don't really merit having more controls put up around us where we're less capable of really understanding what's real and what's not. Instead, we need to be able to kind of make those choices ourselves, and do that with like a kind of set of, kind of really relatively robust, like rational understanding that goes on. And that's really where it needs to start. The UK government's got a green paper out right now called like the internet. It's called the Internet Safety Strategy, and there's a whole bunch of things in there, some good, some bad. And one of those things are lots more education going back towards schools of like kids being online and what is fake news and what is speech and what is right and what is wrong in those kind of areas, and that's good. But then there's also these other areas in terms of like voluntary levies on the social media companies for policing this kind of for policing speech online, and that's where things can get a bit more concerning. And I think ultimately the biggest one of the big problems with any speech discussion now is how partisan we are around what we believe in. So like, free speech is a relatively uncomfortable topic, because what it means is ultimately at its core that there's a whole bunch of things that you fundamentally disagree with, but that you have to accept. This isn't about disagreeable speech that you can then police that. It's about free speech. And we spend a lot of time now shouting down, both from the left and from the right, another person's right to free speech. And we can't, that's ultimately the kind of crux of our problem there. It's that we're in a much more fractured society where we're much more capable of getting like much more knee-jerk in our reaction about a person's right to free speech. And it's a tough one because I'm sympathetic to some of those areas, but and what people say, I'm sympathetic to making sure that we're not exposed to like awful things. But that doesn't mean that we have to draw the line at the point at which things that we just don't like hearing have to be removed. And so we may have to become a bit more uncomfortable to be able to realize that kind of freedom of speech that we were talking about.
Yeah, it's a really difficult sort of path to navigate. I find it quite ironic that the social media firms that we're now worrying about whether they sort of are still bastions of free speech or whether or not, or whether they're the problem, are the exact companies that drove us to this, or at least partially like more partisan rhetoric in society in general, just because of the nature of the algorithms that they use and the kind of bubbles that they create, and that's kind of like pushed us towards only being used to hearing things that we agree with, and then sort of getting outraged, and we get that little dopamine hit, like you said, when we get triggered and like to get up on our high horse and preach about why we're right. I'm definitely guilty of it myself. Can't pretend like I'm perfect.
We've all done it. We've all been there.
Yeah, but it's weird. I don't know how we like walk ourselves back. Something that really sticks with me now, and I didn't really maybe even appreciate the extent to which it's become ever more important at the time. But I think I was about 14, and I was in history class, and we were doing about how do you assess a source. When we're discussing like historical events, and we had to go through this mountain of different ways that a source could be biased. We were sort of going through like photos and like, okay, so what angle is the photo taken from? What time was it? Was it staged? Does this look organic? The same with videos, like what part are they cutting out? Why is this not the full footage? That sort of thing. Then, who's writing it? Who's filming it? Who's putting it out? Like there's so many different ways that a source can be not credible or not 100% credible, and you have to be able to take all of those things and evaluate them and then like put it out. And I remember vividly, like my teacher like played a video from the BBC, and I was like, oh, okay, so now he's showing us a good source. And then he was like, well, this is what they didn't show you, and then like found like organic footage. It was like from some like riot in Northern Ireland in during the Troubles, and I was just like, oh, the BBC can be biased, and like that shattered my worldview a little bit at the time. And it suddenly dawned on me, it's like, right, everyone has a lens that they're looking at the world through, and I think that's like potentially like one of the most important lessons I learned at school, and something that's like only starting to dawn on me as to how important that was. And I think that like potentially that's something that we like really need to focus on. But sort of just to finish up here, actually, Theresa May, something I've been thinking about is Theresa May said the last couple of days, twice now, she's like been condemning Russia for their like fake news and troll factories and like bots and sort of work around the world. And I'm really interested to see where this goes, because there's investigations going on and quite a lot of suggestion that Russia may have been attempting to influence the Brexit vote. And I'm not sure how she reconciles saying Russia tried to influence the Brexit vote with accepting the Brexit vote. Like, I'm not saying that, that was completely influential, that was what tipped the scales. There was a lot of things going on. But I don't know how she like is going to, because she's like openly saying like, Russia, we know what you're doing. You're attempting to meddle in elections. You're weaponizing information. Like these are all things she said in the last couple of days. And yet with such a tight vote, I'm confused as to, do you think she's going to push for any sort of investigation? Do you think there's any way to like measure the sort of influence people can have online in that way? Or what do you reckon?
I mean, this is heavy stuff, I guess. So the one area that we should be going back to look at is how it's still unfolding predominantly, but how the FBI approached the Russian interference in the U.S. the U.S. election. They said that there was obviously a direct attempt by Russia, that they're convinced of that fact, but at no point do they say we believe that the election as a result was compromised in any particular way, that it was a decisive factor. And the thing about an investigation of that ilk, it doesn't require to be shown that the vote could have turned out differently. All that's required to be shown is that there was interference, and so it would be a political decision at the end of it all, right? If they could really show that there was really something fundamental around Russian interference in the Brexit vote, that would then lead to again a political decision that in some way the vote was compromised. But I can't see such a thing occurring. It's much more likely that because it's not required to show that the result would have gone differently, to actually show that there was a crime committed. But it's more likely that we'll just be discussing the effect of that. That we'll just be discussing the fact of the interference rather than the effect of the interference per se, in a kind of legalistic way and in terms of that investigation. I don't think we should be losing sight of the fact that however, that there was obviously a hell of a lot more going on in terms of this micro-targeting of individuals in both of those elections. And so that could be seen as a lot more persuasive, and at no point I'm not suggesting that any of those were per se illegal, although there are still some investigations that need to take place.
There's quite a lot of questions to be answered around funding and sort of why on earth a data firm like Cambridge Analytica gave free services worth millions and millions of pounds to the Leave campaign.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just going to say something I think that needs a little bit more publicity is that the initial Russian sort of, I don't like the term hacking of the US election because I feel like that sort of implies that they legitimately hacked into the voting machines. But the Russian attempts to influence the election, a lot of that narrative was born out of the DNC leak that went on, and to this day the FBI haven't seen the DNC servers. Like, they haven't been in. Like, all of the idea that the DNC was hacked by the Russians is based on evidence given by CrowdStrike, which is a tech firm that was hired by the DNC. Which, like, I still can't get my head around the idea that they're basing, like, obviously there's a lot more stuff that's very demonstrable, like the ads that were bought on social media and the sort of different bots that were being used and where that the bots were being programmed from and geolocated, and obviously all the connections between Trump and Russian, well, not Trump himself yet, the Trump campaign and Russian officials. But the hack itself of the DNC, like, one of the things that would be like really demonstrably like a crime, there's no like publicly available evidence for.
Right.
It's just terrifying, like, that they're like going full steam ahead and just taking the word of, because the DNC are the ones making the allegations, so they're paying a company to provide the evidence that they won't let anyone else see. And I'm not saying
it's the brave new world.
Yeah. Well, I've got that book, The Circle. I've just bought it, and I love the title. It was the Brave New World for Our Brave New World. So I'm looking forward to reading that. But yeah, so anyway, I've got a shoot here, and I'm sure you're a busy guy as well. But
you've got a flight to catch, right? Yeah, I don't have any flights to catch.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, thanks very much for agreeing to chat to me. Really enjoyed getting to sort of work through a couple of different questions I had about data protection and talk about election hacking and censorship of the internet. It's all terrifying and very interesting all at the same time.
Good. No, I'm glad you enjoyed it. This is exactly what we wanted to see more of, just more discussion and more awareness being raised. So, no, thanks for getting in touch.
Yeah, not a problem. So we'll put links for the Open Rights Group and sort of everything we discussed in the link below. And if there's anything you want me to put in, just send me it over and I'll stick it in. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget you can subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. You can get us on YouTube. Thanks very much to Matthew for appearing on the show, to Just Jim for providing music, and thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.